The Five Members, Point of No Return. Chapter 1. The King invades the house. Snow gusts scour Westminster's frost-bitten turrets with relentless, biting fury, howling mournful dirges through the iron-grey January gloom. It is the 4th of January, 1642, and the very air crackles with tinderbox peril. London's labyrinthine winds seethe with the low, menacing murmurs of hot-eyed apprentices drilling by torch glow in moorfields, the wicked glint of new-forged pike tips flashing ominous in tenement gloam, the entire city coiled taut as a matchlock spring on the ragged brink of anarchy. Charles I rides from York at the head of a desperate cavalcade, gaunt and hollow-cheeked in weathered buff coat and polished back and breast, 400 iron-shod horse clattering mercilessly over frozen cobbles toward Whitehall, hooves sparking on rime-slick stones, breath pluming white in glacial wind. His French queen fled weeks prior across the narrow seas, jewel caskets pawned in frantic haste for Swedish shot and Dutch powder. The Long Parliament gnaws his divine prerogative with teeth filed sharp on Puritan grindstones. Ship money condemned as tyranny, Strafford's severed head rotting on Tower Hill, Lord mouldering in episcopal irons. Today, Charles will lance the festering cancer at its heart. 5 men, 5 traitors, Pym the bull-necked plotter from Tavistock's moors, Hampden the unbowed yeoman resister, Hollies the turncoat knight, Hazelrig the iron-faced radical, Strode the venomous pamphleteer, 5 members caballing with Scots Covenanters and Amsterdam gold to topple God's anointed from his sacred throne. Westminster Hall looms colossal through the blizzard's white veil, its ancient hammer-beam vault a cathedral of judgment where Saxon dooms once thundered. Charles dismounts stiffly, boots crunching through frozen ruts, narrow face carved to marble resolve beneath his drooping scarlet plume, dark eyes burning cold as midwinter stars. No parchment warrant in his gloved fist, divine right requires no lawyerly prop. Yet his pulse hammers war drum urgent in his throat, the weight of 11 years' personal rule dragging him to this precipice like a millstone around a drowning man. Arrest them forthwith, he commands his scarred captain, William Lunsford, rugged cavalier of proven blade, pockmarked face set grim, on capital charge of high treason against crown, church, and commonwealth. The Commons' chamber throbs thunderous beneath ancient hammer beams, 400 raw throats baying against the spectral popery of Charles's liturgy. Pym drones on grand remonstrance revisions, that 200-page bill of attainder branding the king incarnate tyrant, every prerogative recast as popish conspiracy. Speaker Lenthall presides uneasy in his flowing gown, plump hands fidgeting on the mace, sweat beading brow, despite the frost seeping through the stone walls. Trumpets bray, brazen from the outer galleries. His sacred majesty graces the house. The chamber plunges from riotous clamour to a silence fraught as a powder room holding its breath. 300 pairs of eyes swivel wide as Charles strides bold into the viper's lair, hat undoffed, plume nodding defiant, Lunsford's 50 grim halberdiers jamming the doorways behind like a steel cork in the Commons' throat. Axe blades glinting in torch flare and winter pallor, Charles halts mid-aisle on ancient flags worn smooth by 8 centuries of scheming feet. Voice pitched crystalline clear above the swelling murmurs. "Gentlemen, I come in person as your king to demand justice." Gasps ripple outward, members half rising, papers rustling frantic. "The privileges of this house, sacred though they be, shall not harbour traitors who plot my death and kingdom's ruin." He names them crisp and unyielding, each syllable a hurled gauntlet: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollers, Sir Arthur Hazelrig, William Strode. Members gape fish-mouthed. Pym rises pale but steady as weathered oak, clutched papers crackling like a shield against royal wrath. Traitors who cabal with Scots, Covenanters thirsting for English blood, who intrigue with foreign gold to unking me. Pandemonium detonates, instantaneous as a primed grenade. Privilege! Privilege of Parliament! Roars the House in stave rhythm thunder, benches thumping approbation, feet stamping flags like war drums. Hazelrig slips lithe toward a side door shadowed by arras. Hampden stands unblinking, quiet grit incarnate. Strode snarls defiance from Puritan benches. Charles gestures sharp to Lunsford. Deliver the traitors into custody. Halberds levelling forward, boots scuffing ancient stones in ominous grind, steel ported at throat height. Members surge as human barricade, heaving tables endwise with splinter crack. Inkpots sail airborne, splattering treason black across periwigs and broadcloth. Papers whirl confetti in the furious melee. But Pym's faction, pre-warned by city spies and backstairs whispers, always one step ahead of royal rashness, melts ghostly into chamber shadows, slipping through hidden posterns and forgotten priest holes to waiting river barges cloaked in downstream fog. Speaker Lenthal plants himself before the Speaker's chair, knees a quiver, yet rooted like ancient yew, blocking the royal path with mace upheld and eyes cast down. May it please your Majesty, I am servant here to this house alone. I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me. Charles wheels on him, furious, plume whipping. What, sirrah, are 30 factious traitors mightier than their anointed king? Lenthal bows not an inch. Galleries erupt above. Outer streets roar tidal privilege as news bolts lightning swift through the city. Church bells clang frantic alarm from 100 steeples. Trained bands muster pikes by companies in Cheapside. London Bridge barricades rising hasty from barrel and chain. Charles stands marooned, stark, mid-chamber, halberds drooping useless as wilted rushes amid the human flood tide. The 5 members vanish traceless like January mist burned off by pale dawn. He surveys the hostile sea of faces, hate, contempt, exultant triumph burning in 300 pairs of eyes. I see, he says at last, voice barely audible above the roar, drained of all fury now, flat and hollow as a cracked bell. I see the birds have flown their cage. He bows curt mockery to the jeering throng and stalks out rigid through the scrum to mounting block and waiting horse. 400 hooves clatter retreat northward into York's frozen snows. London slams her gates thunderous against the tyrant's midnight raid, militia cordons sealing every Thames crossing with lantern and pike. City erupts volcanic, apprentices torch royal effigies in Moorfields, bonfires roaring skyward. Pym hailed Covenant Moses from 100 broadsheet pulpits. 5 members' portraits crowned with laurel on Cheapside pillars amid carnival jubilation. Charles's desperate throw lay in ruins. Parliament's ancient sanctuary violated by mailed fist, sovereignty claimed now invincible against royal encroachment. The realm rends asunder at the thrust. Civil war's spark kindles unquenchable in Westminster's snow-choked nave. Point of no return, crossed, irreversible, catastrophic in the vanished bird's empty cage. Chapter 2. The city slams its gates. Charles retreats to York in seething, impotent fury, Whitehall's gilded halls hollow and echoing at his back, like a mausoleum stripped of its saints. February 1642 bites raw and unrelenting. Frost-crusted northern roads swallow royal couriers whole, their urgent pleas for loyal sheriffs and county levies swallowed by indifferent drifts. But London's pulse races far ahead of any horseman. Apprentices drilling pike drill by guttering torchlight in moorfields, frozen expanse. Merchant guilds quietly melting family plate for Parliament's swelling war chest. Scots envoys whispering promises of Amsterdam gold in the anterooms of Pym's grateful allies. Henrietta's pawned jewels fund Swedish cannon already rolling southward. Newcastle's seized coal pits choke London's forges into shivering silence. Pym, lionized in broadsheets as England's covenant Moses, knits the 5 members' fractured cloth into an unyielding political noose, loop by patient loop. The militia ordinance passed without royal assent, a constitutional earthquake dressed in parliamentary legalese, steals all military commissions county-wide, arming godly, trained bands of London apprentices and Puritan yeomen against the Cavalier gentry still loyal to their anointed king. Grand remonstrance copies flood every market town. Hampton's portrait hangs in Bristol taverns beside the Christ. Hazelrig drills volunteers in Moorfields mud. The 5 members, hunted quarry turned untouchable heroes, have become something more dangerous than traitors. They have become symbols. York's creaking timbered halls fill gradually with the flotsam of a dissolving court. Tarnished cavaliers in patched buff, Irish kerns half-trained and wholly unreliable, county volunteers arriving horseback with more enthusiasm than armour. Charles pores over rough maps by guttering rushlight, tracing with trembling quill the sinews of a kingdom fracturing along county and conscience lines, Oxford for ordnance stocks, Shrewsbury for Welsh horse, Hull for the northern arsenal, Hull whose gates slam shut in his face, its Governor Hotham barring the royal standard from England's own magazine. The humiliation scorches like brand iron, a king denied entry to his own fortified city by a minor functionary emboldened by parliamentary writ. "Raise my standard," Charles decrees at last, voice taut and resolute as a harp-string plucked to breaking. August winds whip Nottingham's ancient hill in mocking gusts. The crimson silk standard snaps and strains against the pole for king, church, and the subject's true liberties. Trumpets braying thin proclamation to indifferent meadows, rain lashing the royal device to bedraggled tatters before the first hour passes. A grim omen his courtiers dare not name aloud. Southward, the serpent coils purposeful. Parliament commissions Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, cautious, methodical, unhurried, with 20,000 London pikes, and provincial horse drawn from the shires of a kingdom already choosing sides in whispers and then shouts. Edgehill's October cornfields erupt in history's first great reckoning. Drummers bleed amid culverin roar and cavalry thunder, Prince Rupert's cavalier horse carving Parliament's van open like ripe wheat under the scythe, brilliant, undisciplined, unstoppable, yet Essex's stubborn London footmen hold the centre ragged, muskets barking defiance from frost-killed hedgerows long after hope seems spent. Charles claims victory as dusk swallows the carnage. Dawn reveals something else entirely. The field, a slaughterhouse of gutted horses and shattered pike-staves, powder spent, surgeons' tents groaning with the crop of war. Essex withdraws intact, unbroken, unbeaten in any decisive sense, and London's gates remain shut against the royal advance. Turnham Green's November confrontation proves the point absolute. 24,000 London-trained bands, shopkeepers and apprentices, shoulder to shoulder in the Brentford lanes, halting the entire Royalist field army by sheer, immovable mass. Charles stares at the bristling hedge of pikes, his own subjects, his own city, denying him entry, and turns his horse's head toward Oxford. The 5 members watch from Thames side windows as the King's Standard retreats westward through November mist. Oxford becomes Charles's court in exile. Bodleian Quad echoes with boot and spur. Christ Church Hall serves as throne room. Merton Garden his queen's melancholy sanctuary when Henrietta returns, briefly from Holland with Dutch arms and French promises. Masks still flicker in candlelit halls, thin gilded illusions of normalcy, while besieging cavalry pickets freeze on Shotover Hill and foraging parties strip Oxfordshire barns to timber and stone. Rupert raids brilliant, but cannot hold ground. Hopton sweeps the southwest but runs dry of powder. Newcastle's northern army dissolves into border fog. The Royalist cause burns bright and brief as marsh fire. Pym dies that December 1643, lauded with a state funeral Parliament cannot quite afford, but his machinery grinds on without him, the alliance with Scotland's Covenanting army transforming the strategic balance overnight. 21,000 Scots crossed the Tweed in January 1644 under seasoned Leslie, and Marston Moore's July thunder seals the North's fate. Rupert's finest cavalry routed by Cromwell's Ironsides, 3,000 cavaliers dead in the dusk, York surrendering her ancient walls to Roundhead's siege. God made them as stubble to our swords, Cromwell writes, ink trembling with the fierce joy of the elect. Charles rides Oxford's walls at night alone, staring north toward extinguished hope. Naseby's June meadow grinds fate to powder. Fairfax's new model army, forged deliberately free of political generals, armoured in Puritan discipline and parliamentary pay, smashes Rupert's impetuous charge with devastating counterstroke. Cromwell's Ironsides sweeping the Royalist flank like God's own cavalry. Charles watches his last field army disintegrate from a gentle Northamptonshire rise, the royal standard tumbling into enemy hands amid the rout, his private correspondence, intimate letters to Henrietta, desperate overtures to Irish rebels and French cardinals captured entire for Pym's heirs to publish as proof of royal duplicity. He flees in drooping scarlet plume through Newark's cold garrison to eventual surrender. Not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army besieging Newark, gambling on Presbyterian sympathy over Puritan vengeance. The Scots deliberate through the winter, feed him and lecture him on Covenant theology, and in January 1647 barter their anointed prisoner to Parliament's commissioners for the outstanding arrears of their army's pay, 40,000 merks in tarnished silver, the precise market rate of a king. The 5 members' prophecy fulfilled in full. Carisbrooke Castle's salt winds scour the Isle of Wight's chalk cliffs as Charles settles into honourable captivity, still scheming with a persistence that borders on the magnificent. Letters flow in invisible ink to Henrietta in Paris, to the Duke of Lorraine, to Irish Confederate commanders still holding Munster bogs in the royal name. He signs the engagement with Scottish commissioners, promising Presbyterian church establishment in England for 3 years, in exchange for a Scottish invasion to restore him. The secret ink barely dry before Parliament's agents decipher every word. The Second Civil War erupts, 1648. Kentish gentry rising, Welsh garrisons mutinying, Hamilton's Scottish army invading from the north, and Cromwell crushes each rebellion with methodical, terrifying speed. Preston's August battle destroying the Scots in 3 days of relentless pursuit through Lancashire lanes. Each suppressed, rising deepens the new model army's conviction. While Charles lives, England bleeds. The officers meet at Windsor in prayer, 3 days of scripture and searching, and emerge resolved. The king is that man of blood, accountable before God for every drop spilled in his name. Pride's purge. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride's musketeers stationed at Common's door, arresting or turning back 200 Presbyterian moderates in the fog-rimed December dawn, leaves the Rump Parliament, 50 men willing to do what England has never done in recorded history: try and execute their anointed king. Charles watches from Carisbrook's window as the parliamentary barge draws to the castle quay. He dresses with elaborate, unhurried care, black velvet doublet, white linen collar starched immaculate, the blue garter ribbon pinned precise at his breast. He has rehearsed for this. Not the scaffold, not yet, but the tribunal, the performance, the final act of a reign conducted as sacred theatre. The 5 birds have long since flown their cage. Now the cage itself comes for the keeper. Point of no return crossed not once but 100 times, in Westminster snow, in Oxford mud, in Nazeby's blood-churned meadow, in Carisbrook's salt wind. The trial's shadow lengthens over England entire. Chapter 3. The Man of Blood. On trial, January 1649 descends upon London like a funeral pall, the Thames sluggish and iron-grey beneath skies that have forgotten the meaning of sunlight. Westminster Hall, that vast, echoing nave of English justice, where kings once feasted in coronation splendour, and Warren Hastings trembled before Burke's eloquence, now serves a purpose no English constitutional mind has ever dared contemplate, let alone execute. The Hammerbeam vault soars indifferent above the proceedings, ancient oak witnessing what ancient precedent expressly forbids: the trial of a sovereign by his own subjects, the sacred chain of divine kingship hauled before a committee of lawyers, soldiers, and Puritan zealots, and demanded to account for itself in dock. Charles enters Westminster Hall on the 20th of January 1649 with the measured, unhurried tread of a man who has spent 30 days steeling himself for precisely this moment. Not the scaffold, not yet, but something in many ways more terrifying. The spectacle of sacred monarchy humiliated by process, stripped of its mystique by the grinding machinery of judicial procedure. He is dressed with elaborate, defiant care, black velvet doublet immaculate, white linen collar starched to razor crispness, the blue garter ribbon pinned precise at his breast as if attending a court masque, rather than his own capital trial. His beard is neat, his bearing composed, his dark eyes moving with cool, assessing intelligence across the ranked faces of his judges. He will not flinch. He will not beg. He has decided this with the clarity of a man who has finally, catastrophically, run out of options and found in their absence a terrible, purifying freedom. John Bradshaw presides, Sergeant at Law promoted far beyond his peacetime station by the logic of revolutionary necessity, a hat lined with iron plate against anticipated assassins, his face a mask of prosecutorial severity beneath the black judicial cap. 68 commissioners range in tiers behind, colonels, country gentlemen, lawyers who have somehow persuaded themselves that what they are doing is not regicide, but justice. The public galleries heave with spectators, Puritan matrons in severe linen, city merchants calculating the odds of republic versus restored monarchy, foreign ambassadors scribbling frantic dispatches to bewildered sovereigns across the Channel. Charles Stuart, King of England, Bradshaw's voice booms the length of the hall, each syllable a hammer blow on the anvil of precedent. You are charged by the Commons of England with high treason, that you have levied war against the Parliament and people of England, compassed the destruction of their liberties, and are thereby guilty of the deaths of all persons who have perished in the wars of your own causing. Charles fixes Bradshaw with a gaze of measured, aristocratic contempt, not theatrical fury, but something colder and more devastating, the patient derision of a man who genuinely believes the entire proceeding to be a grotesque, constitutional absurdity. I would know by what lawful authority I am brought hither. The question detonates in the hall's silence like a grenade tossed into a vestry. It is not evasion. It is the precise, lawyerly thrust of a man who has identified the fatal flaw in his enemy's armor and drives the blade home with both hands. What authority? Parliament is rump of rump. Pride's musketeers expelled its majority on a foggy December morning scant weeks past, leaving 50 compliant regicides to commission this tribunal. No king, no lords, no full commons, merely the army's political instrument draped in parliamentary fiction. Bradshaw bangs his gavel, face reddening, in the name of the people of England by whom you were entrusted. From the galleries, a woman's voice slashes the judicial solemnity, sharp, accented, fearless, not half nor a quarter of them. Oliver Cromwell is a traitor. Lady Fairfax, wife of the very general commanding Parliament's armies, speaking the unspeakable from behind her masquerade visor. Guards surge. She vanishes. The hall erupts briefly before Bradshaw's gavel restores strained order. Charles permits himself the ghost of a smile. The sessions repeat with ritual futility across 5 grinding days. Bradshaw demands the king plead to the charges. Charles refuses recognition of the court's jurisdiction with calm, unyielding consistency. I am entrusted with the liberties of my people, he insists, voice never rising from its measured, schooled control. You cannot try a king. Kings are answerable to God alone, and to that tribunal I cheerfully submit. But to this, a slight, dismissive gesture encompassing the ranked commissioners, the soldiers, the entire improvised machinery of revolutionary justice, to this I owe no answer, for it has no lawful warrant over me. It is, paradoxically, the finest constitutional argument of his entire reign. The man who dissolved 3 parliaments, levied ship money without grant, attempted to arrest the 5 members, plunged his kingdom into 2 civil wars, and conspired with its enemies during captivity. This same man, in the dock, articulates with devastating precision the principle his judges are violating: that sovereignty cannot try itself, that legitimacy cannot be conjured by declaration alone, that the law which condemns him is the law he himself embodied, and to unmake one is to unmake the other. His judges know he is right. That is precisely why they cannot permit him to speak further. On 27th of January, Bradshaw pronounces sentence: death by severing of the head from the body. The commissioners rise to ratify. 59 signatures on the death warrant, some written firm, some shaking. One man signing twice in apparent compulsion, another dragged bodily to the table by Cromwell's insistent hand. Cromwell himself signs bold, Oliver Cromwell, ink as dark and unequivocal as the deed itself. Charles receives the sentence without visible perturbation. I am not suffered to speak, he says simply, gathering his hat and gloves with unhurried precision as guards close around him. Expect what justice other people will have. The 3 days between sentence and execution pass in a strange, suspended clarity. Charles moves through them with the disciplined calm of a man who has at last been relieved of uncertainty. The worst has been confirmed, the waiting finished, and in that terrible completion lies a kind of peace. He meets his children. Young Henry and Elizabeth brought to St. James's Palace for a final audience. Elizabeth, 13 and pale, weeps inconsolably. Charles holds her, instructs her to be obedient to her mother, to fear God, to forgive his enemies. "Sweetheart," he tells the girl gently, "you will forget this." She shakes her head against his chest, certain she will not. She never does, carrying the memory of that cold January embrace to her early grave in Carisbrook's damp keep, mere months later. He sleeps soundly the night before his execution, to the reported astonishment of his jailers. 30. January 1649. Whitehall's black-draped scaffold rises stark against a sky the colour of pewter. Sawdust thick on the boards, the block low and mean, deliberately so, forcing the condemned to lie prostrate, rather than kneel upright. The final small humiliation of sovereign reduced to supplicant. Snow has fallen overnight. The cobbles gleam treacherous silver in the cold morning light. Crowds press behind infantry cordons along the street, breath steaming, faces unreadable, grief, relief, prurient fascination, genuine anguish mingled in proportions impossible to calculate from horseback height. Charles wakes at 5, dresses with characteristic meticulous care. 2 shirts. "The season is sharp," he explains to his attendant, Bishop Juxon, with almost domestic practicality. "I would not have them think I trembled from fear." He prays long and in silence, dines lightly, a piece of bread, a glass of claret. Receives Bishop Juxon's final communion with closed eyes and what Juxon later describes as wonderful serenity. At 10 o'clock, he walks through the banqueting house past Rubens's magnificent ceiling where painted Charles, idealized and immortal in allegorical triumph, gazes down upon the mortal Charles walking beneath toward the scaffold window and steps through into the bitter January air. The crowd surges and is pushed back by pikemen. He is surprised, briefly, by the hush. No jeering, no catcalls, just that vast, breathless silence of a crowd witnessing something it cannot quite believe is actually happening. He speaks on the scaffold, voice steady and carrying to those close enough to hear above the wind. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be. I shall be very little missed." He denies being the people's enemy. "I never did begin a war with the 2 houses of Parliament." He forgives his executioners. He pardons his kingdom. He prays briefly, alone, eyes closed, lips moving without sound. Then he removes the garter ribbon, the doublet, the cloak, tucks his grey hair beneath a white satin cap with practiced care, kneels before the block, extends his arms, the signal. The axe falls in a single, clean stroke. The crowd's response is unlike anything recorded before or since in English history, a long collective groan that rises from 10,000 throats simultaneously, a sound witnesses would describe for the rest of their lives as the most terrible they had ever heard. Not triumph, not grief exactly, but the involuntary exhalation of a people watching something irreplaceable shatter. An England that had existed since Plantagenet sinew and Tudor blood, giving way all at once to something cold, new, and utterly without precedent. A young man faints in the crowd. Soldiers dip handkerchiefs in the pooling blood, some as trophies, some perhaps as relics. The king who refused to surrender power has surrendered everything. The 5 members flew their cage on a January afternoon 7 years prior, pre-warned, fleet-footed, escaping down fog-shrouded Thames to City Sanctuary. That moment, that instant of royal overreach and parliamentary defiance had set the irreversible mechanism in motion. Westminster violated, London inflamed, the North abandoned, the standard raised, 2 civil wars fought and lost, a king sold like livestock for Scottish army arrears, tried by his own subjects in his own hall, and executed on a black-draped scaffold outside his own banqueting house. Cromwell's iron boot descends where Stuart crown once shone. Republic rises gaunt and humorless from regicide's shadow. The locked door of 1629, the violated house of 1642, both opening finally onto the same abyss, the same cold January morning, the same clean downward arc of steel through winter air. Point of no return, crossed, complete, irrevocable. In the hush, after the axe falls, England stands alone in the wreckage of its old certainties, blinking in the pale light of a republic nobody quite planned and nobody quite wanted. Sovereign without a sovereign, a body politic without its head, a kingdom with no king. The birds had flown, the cage stood empty, and the man who built it lay on the boards at last, finally, catastrophically still. Chapter 4. The kingdom without a king, the republic is born screaming into a January frost nobody asked for, and nobody quite knows how to govern. It is February 1649, and England stands in the rubble of its own constitutional certainties, blinking like a man who has just demolished his own house with a sledgehammer, and now stands in the cold rain, wondering where he will sleep. The monarchy is abolished by Act of Parliament. What remains of Parliament, the House of Lords dissolved as useless and dangerous, the very office of kingship erased from English law with the brisk efficiency of men terrified that if they pause to consider what they have done, their nerve will fail entirely. Oliver Cromwell stands at the centre of the wreckage, and he is not a man who pauses. He is 50 years old, barrel-chested, wart-scarred, driven by a Calvinist certainty as immovable as English granite that God has chosen him as his instrument for England's purification, though the precise nature of that purification shifts with unnerving regularity according to political necessity. He has signed a king's death warrant. He has won 2 civil wars. He commands the most battle-hardened professional army England has ever fielded, and he has absolutely no idea what to do next. The Rump Parliament sits and squabbles over its own constitutional legitimacy, 50 men governing 11 million, with the authority of men who know they govern by the sword alone, dressed in the thinning finery of parliamentary procedure. They debate, they committee, they delay. Cromwell watches from the army's perspective with mounting volcanic impatience. These men, these lawyers and country gentlemen who sat compliant through Pride's purge and signed or acquiesced in regicide, now drag their feet on the godly reformation that was the entire point of the exercise. The 5 members haunt the Republic's corridors like uninvited ghosts. Hampton dead at Charlegrove Field, 1643. A royalist cavalry skirmish claiming the man whose ship money resistance lit the constitutional fire. Pym, dead of cancer, that same December. Hollies fled to exile in Presbyterian disgust at the army's radicalism. Haselrig sitting wary in the Rump, watching Cromwell with the eyes of a man who has survived this long by reading rooms accurately. Strode dead before the Republic's first anniversary. The 5 who fled down Thames in January fog, the men whose escape from Charles's bungled arrest sparked the final conflagration, have not lived to see what their survival wrought. The Republic is an orphan, its godparents dead or disillusioned. Ireland burns first. Cromwell lands at Dublin in August 1649 with 12,000 veterans, the new model's finest, and proceeds to demonstrate that the Republic's violence is not reserved for kings. Drogheda falls in September. The garrison put to the sword after refusing quarter, priests bludgeoned in their churches, the town's population reduced to ash and silence in a single night's systematic slaughter. Wexford follows in October, massacre replicated with methodical thoroughness. "I am persuaded," Cromwell writes to Parliament afterward, his pen steady as his conviction, "that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches." He returns to England a conqueror, leaves Ireton to finish the Irish campaign with comparable ruthlessness, and turns north to Scotland, where Charles II, the dead king's eldest son, has accepted the covenant and been crowned at Scone, threatening to undo the Republic with a reconstituted Stuart Presbyterian alliance. Dunbar, September 1650. 3,000 Scots dead, 10,000 captured, Leslie's army destroyed in the Grey Dawn by Cromwell's inspired improvisation. Worcester, September 1651, the Republic's final battle. Charles II's last royalist army smashed, the young king fleeing in disguise through sympathetic safe houses and a famous oak tree to eventual French exile. The Republic is secure, the threat is ended, England is at peace, and Cromwell finds in peace what the 5 members might have told Charles a decade prior, that governing England without adequate constitutional authority is an exercise in daily, grinding humiliation. The rump continues to sit and irritate. April 1653. Cromwell strides into the Commons' chamber with a file of musketeers at his back, and here history performs its most sardonic repetition, the echo deliberate and devastating. Where Charles entered Westminster with 400 horse and royal warrant, demanding the arrest of 5 men, demanding that Parliament yield its privileges to prerogative, and failed, and destroyed himself in the failure, Cromwell enters with soldiers and no warrant at all, no legal fiction even attempted, nothing but the naked force his predecessor lacked the resolution to deploy. He surveys the benches with a contempt 11 years in the distilling. "You are no Parliament, I say you are no Parliament." He walks the chamber, pointing at individual members. "Some of you are drunkards," he tells one, "corrupt and unjust men, and scandalous to the profession of the gospel." He seizes the parliamentary mace, that same symbol Lenthal brandished against Charles in 1642, and calls it a fool's bauble. "Take away that shining bauble. Here, take it away." Musketeers usher the rump into the cold April air. Parliament, the institution for which 2 civil wars were fought, for which Charles I was tried and beheaded, the supreme expression of English constitutional principle, locked out of its own chamber by soldiers in 40 minutes. The Republic has become the thing it murdered. Cromwell rules thereafter as Lord Protector, a title carefully chosen to avoid the word king while performing every function thereof. He governs with a privy council, calls and dissolves parliaments at need, wages foreign wars by personal decision, collects taxes by military ordinance, censors the press, and suppresses dissent with tools Charles would have recognised and envied. When Parliament offers him the crown in 1657, the humble petition and advice, England's constitutional body essentially begging its military ruler to formalise what everyone already knows, Cromwell agonises for 6 weeks. He refuses ultimately, not from Republican principle but from the army's opposition. His generals, his Ironsides, will not serve a king, even if that king is Oliver Cromwell. He takes instead the same power under another name: the Protectorate, kingship without the word, monarchy without the mystique. Charles I would have understood the predicament perfectly. The irony is absolute and unsparing. The Republic, born from the principle that no man should hold absolute power, has produced a ruler with more unchecked authority than the Stuart kings ever wielded. No parliamentary tradition to restrain him, no ancient constitutional framework to appeal to, just the sword and the Calvinist conviction of election. Cromwell dies in September 1658, the date remembered later as a night of the greatest storm in living English memory. Trees uprooted from Cornwall to Yorkshire, roofs stripped, church steeples felled, as if the weather itself marked the passing of a force too large for ordinary mortality. He leaves the Protectorate to his son Richard, a gentle, unmilitary man entirely unsuited to governing by sword, who resigns within 8 months under army pressure and retires to quiet Hampshire obscurity. The Republic collapses not with a bang, but with the weary shrug of exhausted men who have run out of constitutional fictions to sustain it. May 1660, Charles II rides into London on his 30th birthday amid celebrations of extraordinary, almost hysterical joy. The crowds that line the Strand stretch beyond sight. Flowers carpet the road, bells ring from every steeple simultaneously, the sound a physical wave across the city. Pepys watches from a boat on the Thames, weeping openly, "I blessed God, and may it be forever." 11 years of republic, of decimation taxes, major generals policing neighbourhoods, Christmas band, theatres shut, maypoles torn down, the grinding Puritan insistence that joy itself was suspect, evaporates in a single afternoon of sunlight and cheering, and the easy, practiced charm of a Stuart king who has learned in exile that kings survive by being loved, not feared. The 5 members' legacy resolves into this: the constitutional principle that Parliament could not be overridden by royal prerogative, the principle for which Pym plotted and Hampden died and Holles suffered exile, is quietly, permanently absorbed into English constitutional practice. But the Republic built on that principle is dismantled, the regicides hunted and executed or exiled, Cromwell's corpse exhumed from Westminster Abbey and hanged in chains at Tyburn as posthumous punishment for killing the father. The monarchy restored, Parliament supreme. The contradiction somehow, magnificently, typically English, resolved by pretending it was never a contradiction at all. Stand in Westminster Hall today, that same vast, hammer-beam space where Charles I faced his judges and refused to plead, and listen to what the stones remember. They remember a king who rode in with 400 horse to arrest 5 men, and found an empty chamber, birds flown, cage hollow. They remember a Lord Protector who drove out a parliament with musketeers and called its symbol a bauble. They remember Lenthall's immovable answer, "I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak," but as this House directs, the finest statement of parliamentary principle in the English language, delivered on shaking knees by a frightened man to an armed and furious king. They remember what the 5 members understood, that Charles I, for all his intelligence and genuine conviction, could never grasp, that power, in England, derives its legitimacy not from heaven, but from consent, that the moment a king, or a protector, or a parliament chooses force over persuasion, the blade turns in the hand and cuts the wielder. Charles locked a door in 1629. He stormed a chamber in 1642. He lost his head in 1649. The birds flew. The kingdom bled. The lesson cost everything. And England, battered, blood-soaked, exhausted, magnificent, learned it anyway.